listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in to Awake in Relationship. My name is Silas Rose. Without question, 2020 has been a whopper of a year for most of us. Between COVID-19, the climate crisis, an economy in free fall, and massive social unrest, you might be feeling the need to find a tribe. Community is more important than ever, but as many of us in this new normal are spending more time online and at home, it's harder than ever to form those intimate bonds. In this episode of Awake in Relationship, I speak with Ame Lia Tamburrini, a community engagement consultant and changemaker, about the power of circle dialogue to create spaces for safe sharing, resolving conflict, and create connection among diverse communities. In this conversation, we also talk about using the principles of circling as a path of personal and organizational transformation. Please stay tuned. Good afternoon, Ame Lia, and thank you so much for joining Awake in Relationship.
Hi, Silas. So great to be here with you. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm really excited to have this conversation, talk about circling. It really seems like a powerful tool for connection, especially in this time when there's so much isolation and loneliness.
I agree 100%.
So, I'm really curious. You started out in your professional life focusing on the body, as a kinesiologist and I believe a health researcher. What got you interested in group facilitation work and circling?
Yeah, I think what really led me here was my everlasting interest in human health, as well as some observations I was making around how the ways in which we engage with each other actually do impact health. So I'll take you on a little bit of a journey, but yes, I'm a kinesiologist and epidemiologist by training. And those degrees really represent that evolving interest in health, from the inner workings of the human body to more of these broad social and economic determinants of our well-being. And that work led me into this field of health impact assessment, which is really all about taking research and helping decision makers understand the linkages between big developments and policies and how those influence health and well-being. To do that work well, it required engaging with a lot of diverse groups of people in community. And so with the organization that I worked with at the time, that meant I got to travel all around the world and engage with rural and indigenous communities around the world, which was a really great experience. And I learned a lot of things. But the one thing that really struck with me was that the way in which we engage with community actually had an impact on the health and well-being of the people, which I thought that was fascinating. So oftentimes, the ways in which we gathered people together left people more divided than they were before we even interacted with them, because this space and time was created for people's positions to come to the surface, like I'm for, I'm against, whatever this decision happened to be. But no space and time was given to dive deeper into why people had those opinions. And especially in rural, remote communities where everybody knows everybody, that resulted in quite a bit of divisiveness, which negatively influenced health through stress and sense of belonging and social connectedness. So I just found that observation really fascinating to me. And the thing that really started to shift my perspective around the ways in which we engage was actually working with Indigenous community. And in some of those cases, I did have the opportunity to gather in ways that did not lead to divisiveness. In fact, it actually led to this greater sense of connectedness and a deeper understanding of one another. And that's what really piqued my interest in getting very intentional about the ways in which we bring people together to have conversation.
So how long ago was that when you first kind of got into that work?
Health impact assessment, that was around 2008.
Well, you've definitely been on quite a journey and actually come full circle in terms of focusing on your own body and health, having gone through a very kind of profound healing kind of journey with cancer in the past year. And I've really noted in your demeanor and your messaging in terms of your work, this kind of real shift of focus. And I'm wondering what kind of changed for you having gone through that experience.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this into the dialogue. Just before I was diagnosed with cancer, I had left a very secure, well-paying, lots of benefits job at the government and decided to start this company, Hum. And of course, many people at this point would say, oh my goodness, well, how unlucky, how terrible, that just sucks. And for me, that really never crossed my mind, just because of the way I am in the world. But very quickly, after getting over the shock of this diagnosis, I really did see cancer as the ultimate opportunity from the universe to get super clear on what my purpose was and to not waste another moment on this planet doing things that were not in alignment with it. And so in practical terms, what that meant was that I was no longer available to doing work that did not bring me joy and that did not fully utilize the gifts that I had. And so that's when my company, at least, I think, and a lot of my relationships in life also pivoted. The original intent of Hum was to be an exceptional, but still fairly run-of-the-mill community engagement company, really focused on bringing community voice into decision-making. But what it turned into was more of a mission-based company where the sole purpose is to decrease divisiveness and increase interconnectedness so that ultimately there's more love and joy in our world, because I think that's my purpose, to bring that to fruition. And so that's what Hum does. It creates spaces for conversations that I actually think people are really eager to have, but for various reasons, no one is having them. And so I use circle dialogue to step into that space with people.
What do you think are some of the blocks to those conversations?
I think in some part it's not our social norm. It is our social norm to stay on the surface, to talk about the comings and goings of our day, to talk about the news. And it's not so much part of our way of being with one another to go deeper. And it's uncomfortable. There's vulnerability in that space to open up. And that takes courage, and it takes a supportive environment to step into that space. So I think those factors contribute.
So as for the origins of the work, you mentioned your previous experiences kind of working in First Nations communities. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where circling came from and maybe go into a little bit more detail about some of your early experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, from what I know, and most of what I know is gathered from Christina Baldwin, and she's been doing circle work for quite a while. In her work, she speaks about circle beginning with the controlled use of fire. So just think about starting a fire and gathering around it. And that use of fire started with another hominid that actually no longer exists, the Homo erectus. And that we're talking over 200,000 years ago. So using this way of fire was passed on to us, the Homo sapiens. And there's lots of archaeological proof of this way of gathering, dating back 125,000 years ago in South Africa. But using this way of fire was kind of new. And what it did was it allowed people to gather together for longer periods of time. It also provided safety and warmth and food for one another. And the other cool thing that it did was, yes, it was essential for survival, but it also expanded the use of language as a tool for social order, because people were gathered together for longer periods of time. Dialogue started to come out in different ways. So that's the original origins of this way of gathering. And of course, today there are many Indigenous communities that use this way of gathering to share teachings and to govern and to have ceremony together. But I would actually say that regardless of any of our backgrounds, we've all been part of circle dialogue if we've ever attended a house party. Because, what happens there?
No, those often aren't so intentional.
Yes, exactly. But we find ourselves usually in the kitchen, and we're gathered around an island or a table, and we're sharing stories. And I think that's because it's so deeply ingrained in us, this natural way of being, and we're called to it. My own personal experiences of circle were around a campfire in the middle of the woods during bush parties when I was a teenager. Mm-hmm. But later in life, I was exposed to this way of gathering and dialogue in Indigenous communities. So in India and in Burkina Faso, all of our meetings with small village communities were held in circle. And there was ceremony involved, and there was just tons and tons of listening. And I was so fascinated by those experiences, by the protocols that were in place that you sort of had to figure out as you watched how things worked. And by the way in which time really stood still in those moments, and by the ways in which decisions were made. So that experience, I think, really hit me in my heart at a core level. And of course, it didn't come to fruition in terms of me practicing circle until many, many years later, where I actually did some training and now use it as a primary tool in my business.
So I've been a part of many groups over the course of my life, both as a participant and facilitator, and it almost seems like there's this intangible element that either brings group cohesion or kind of pulls things apart. What are some of the principles that help to create the safety in a group environment for deep sharing?
Yes, I think there are a number of ways in which you can create that in circle. And the first one is really about tending to the center of the circle. So coming back to the origins, there's that fire in the middle. Well, when we do circle, often there's a symbolic representation of that fire, which is the thing that draws people in energetically to the space. When we recreate that, we're often putting things like the values, principles, or maybe it's a vision that we want to uphold in the center. And that's something that people can focus on when emotion comes up, when the shadow elements start to arise. People can speak into that center of the circle as opposed to speaking directly at another individual in the group. And I think that is supportive for really establishing and maintaining connection between participants. The other piece in circle is the formation of agreements. And those are certainly the things that we will co-create at the very beginning of circle to ensure that everybody feels safe. So common agreements that people can create are around confidentiality. Timeliness is sometimes really important for circles, remaining open and withholding judgments. I recently participated in a really brave dialogue, and one of the agreements that I really appreciated was anything said here is not going to later cause us harm. Anything said here is not going to later cause us harm. And I love this principle mainly because of the social media world that we live in. Things can so be easily transported outside. But it relates to just the sacredness of the space and what gets shared in there, and can even carry over into, for example, if two people from circle decide they're going to go meet up for coffee the next day, and somebody in that group decides to bring up something somebody shared in circle, that in and of itself is sort of a violation of the safety of circle, because what comes out of us in that space is quite vulnerable, and there isn't that safety in other environments. So it sort of transports between worlds these sets of agreements. I do think that the other safety piece is consistency. And I think about this especially in groups that have experienced a lot of trauma, or in youth in particular that have some unstable home environments, that starting and ending on time is really important, and also bringing in the similar structure each week, so that people know what they're going to expect in that space.
As a person that's led groups, one of the things I find most challenging is when there's an individual that is very caught in their story or is very emotional and has kind of lost contact with those agreements. So how as a facilitator do you deal with those kinds of challenges?
Oh, I love this question, Silas. It's like the perfect cocktail party question too, because as a facilitator, people always want to know, how do we deal with people?
What's your secret?
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, I have to ground this in my own personal experience, because there's work involved in this for me, because I have my own history and trauma around anger and using my voice. So, in my household growing up, there was a lot of anger, and it wasn't a house where I felt safe to use my voice. And so being around people who are angry and talk on and on with seeming no regard for others is actually very triggering for me. So that just speaks to the fact that as a facilitator, you may have your own work to do as well to be able to hold space. And that's certainly been true for me. And so as a host of Circle, I really see myself as the holder of the space. So I'm ensuring that all voices are heard and there is that sense of safety. So yeah, constantly monitoring in terms of how people are reacting to other people's shares. And certainly in these situations where there's anger or a lot of emotion, it can be quite unsettling for people. And so there is a responsibility to take action, I think. What I do before I act is really try to get clear on my intention. So I've seen many people, myself included, get really triggered by the disruption, and I wait too long. And then when I finally interrupt, I'm coming from that place of wronging the person or wanting to shut them down. But that's my own protective mechanism coming into play. And so it's really getting myself clear on that before I act. And I think what helps me to clear that energy is remembering that getting stuck in our stories and being angry is actually a really painful place to be. We've all been there. And those emotions and ways of being are actually a protective mechanism that is covering up more powerful emotions like grief or powerlessness or disappointment. So for me, that takes sort of the scary factor off of it and really helps me gain a connection with that person that's sharing. And as a host, I also see my role as trying to support that person to get free of their story so that they can tap into that emotion and release themselves from that suffering that they're doing. Interruption, I think, is necessary. And I think we have stories around that in our culture as well, that interrupting people is rude, is disrespectful. But if we hold the belief that we're really allowing an opportunity to really support this person, it can really shift the energy. So yeah, for me, I ask, may I interrupt you? Sometimes I just say, hey, Judy, I'm going to step in here. And if time is really tight, sometimes that's enough sometimes you just have to move on and say, we really appreciate that, there are things to share here and we need to make sure these other folks have a voice. I want to support you afterwards though. And I really want to support you in helping communicate what it is that's going on for you. So let's chat afterwards. And sometimes it's really powerful to do that work with them in the circle. So if the time is there, sometimes it's effective to really state what you think you're hearing. So not repeating the story that they've been sharing with you, but really tell them what you hear under the story, that, it sounds like you're hurt right now or worried or you feel betrayed, whatever the situation is. And you don't have to be right. They will let you know if you're right or not. And often that's enough to shift the story and take it in another direction. And some people aren't ready to go there. And if they resist and go back into story, then that's okay. And that's when you really want to just move forward, but then absolutely offer them an opportunity to work with them to help them express themselves in a way that others will be able to understand what's happening for them.
one of the most powerful facilitation tools I've seen utilized in kind of a emotionally charged environment is just space where people are asked to pause and just feel what they're feeling before kind of moving on.
Yes, I love that.
There seems to be a lot of parallels between reflective, transformative work that's done in group and also our personal work. And I know that you're a meditator. Do you make that connection?
I do. I think doing this sort of work really requires a level of emotional intelligence, as they're calling it these days. And for me, that's really about becoming aware of what I'm feeling. And meditation has been extraordinarily supportive for me to just create that space to go quiet and listen to myself and what's happening.
Without breaking confidentiality, I'm wondering if there are any kind of examples of transformations that you witnessed in group recently.
I won't get into any specifics, but I can tell you of things that I have witnessed in circle. So I have seen people, myself included, actually get to the root of issues that have been bothering them for many, many years and finding ways to work through that. So I guess as a more personal example, my coming to terms with my whole childhood, the traumas that I experienced, I was really not aware of that until I started sharing in circle. And I was listening to other people's stories and kind of comparing them to what was coming out of my mouth and realizing that there was a real difference in experiences of childhood. And that really led me down this path of exploring that work and doing my own healing around it. So I really attribute the circle process to that because I have been in therapy, I've been in coaching, I've been in other circumstances where that never came to the surface. I have also seen conflict resolved in really honest and heartfelt ways that shifted people's perspectives on how to handle confrontation and resulted in people feeling much more connected with one another during the day. And I think that's such a beautiful example of what can happen in circle and that we don't necessarily get a lot of experience with outside of circle. And when that safety net can be created for an experience like that to happen, it can be extraordinarily impactful on people.
So we're living in a very uncertain time with COVID, when there's a lot of isolation and loneliness, and many people are feeling the fragility of their relationships. How can circling help to strengthen our social networks and potentially expand them?
It's such a great question. I want to really tap into the context of what's happening right now. We all, I think, have experienced various degrees of trauma in our own lives, and that creates our own patterns and ways of being. And in this particular time, layered on top of all that are, yes, coronavirus, but there's also systemic racism being brought to light. There's the Me Too events. There's climate change. There's reconciliation. All of these things are also spaces where a lot of healing is required if we're really going to take effective actions to create a different way of being in our world and create a different world. And I think that's where a lot of the conflict is arising from, is that we have this maybe a little more spaciousness in our lives where we are able to dig deeper into what are our priorities, what is important to us. Couple that with a lot of the stress and worries that are going on, and that naturally does create a certain level of disruption. But I do think that disruption is a good thing. It means that we are stopping and we are listening and we're asking ourselves what is really needed in this moment. And so I think just overarchingly saying, recognizing that there is fragility in our relationships and not to be scared of it, to sort of welcome that in as a sign that things are changing. But aside from that, in terms of circle and how that could be used, I think it's helpful to compare it to the ways in which we tend to gather. So when we gather, I talked about this a little bit before, but we're usually sharing our events with one another. You know, where am I going for holidays? Did you read that terrible thing in the newspaper? You know, who's driving me nuts at work today? And we kind of keep the conversation at that level. And often in that space, we're giving advice, we're fixing people's problems for them. But what we're not doing in those spaces is really inspiring people to be their own agents of change. We're not learning to trust our intuition, and we're not really deeply listening to what's going on underneath the story and diving into that space. And I think interacting in that way keeps us separate. It's a very safe place to be, to exchange ideas and to give advice, but there's no vulnerability in that. And I think vulnerability is really the key to deepening our relationships and this sense of connection, which is so needed right now. And so when we gather in circle, we are being vulnerable. We're saying, you know, I believe in you, and I think that you have all the knowledge that you need inside you to thrive and survive. And I'm curious about you, and I'm curious about myself. And all those acts are really courageous. And when we do those courageous acts together, we can form deeper bonds with one another. So in terms of new relationships, I think the more diverse your circle is, the richer it will be. I can share that in a women's circle I just participated in, or co-hosted, actually, we had moms, we had divorcees, we had people who had never been married, we had people with kids and without, we had more monogamous aligned people and more polyamorous aligned people, and age ranges from mid-20s to 50s. And it was such a beautiful experience. None of those details actually mattered. And I would say that the different details of each of our lives only serve to really deepen our understanding of ourselves and our connection with one another. So I think Circle has lots of potential for, deepening our relationships and also expanding who's in our circle.
Yeah, that's the power of a safe container.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed.
Well, Ame Lia, thank you so much for this conversation. It's really important work. I hope in the future we can talk again. How can people learn more about what you do?
Well, they can go to my website, humconsulting.ca. That's 1M. And on that site is really where all the information is. So I have information about Circle and about some of the talks that I give. You can also sign up for my newsletter. It comes out once a month. And I also have a blog on there, which is a great way to get to know me and just how I'm processing the world.
Awesome. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Silas.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Ame Lia. I know I'm feeling super inspired about starting some community circles. If you want to find out more about Ame Lia's work, head on over to humconsulting.ca. That's HUM consulting.ca, and I'll be sure to post some links in the show notes to this episode at awakenrelationship.com. While you're there, please don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. This fall, I'm going to be hosting a free webinar series all about connecting during COVID and featuring some of the great thought leaders that have been on the show. I think you'll love the content, so please sign up for the newsletter and you'll be the first to learn about that. And as always, I really appreciate any feedback and ideas around the show. You can send me a message through the website or reach out on the socials at Instagram and Twitter. So until next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.